Hi, Gen Bio. This week in lab, we are going to be discussing angiosperm anatomy as well as angiosperm reproduction. So as I've done in the past, I've broken this into two portions just to break it up a little bit and pace ourselves a bit. So this first part is going to be focusing on anatomy of angiosperms, specifically looking at flowers and fruits. And then the second video will be focused on angiosperm reproduction. Okay, so first we're gonna talk about anatomy. And we have already touched on angiosperms to some degree. We should know that they are flowering land plants. And we looked at the roots and stems 2 weeks ago in our microscope slides. And then last week we looked at the leaves, also under the microscope, examined the stomata and the guard cell movements. And then this week, we're really going to focus on seeds, flowers, and fruits. Okay. So angiosperms are sub classified into either the monocot species or the dicot species. And this name or classification is taken from the seed within the plant, within the angiosperm, having either one or two cotyledons. So obviously, if it has one cotyledon, it would be a monocot. And if it has two, it would be a dicot. Okay. And these are cotyledons are the seed leaves. They are often responsible for providing food, either through storage or initially, sometimes through initial photosynthesis for the seedling, for the growing plant embryo. And so I'll just direct your attention over here to this picture where you can see a monocot seed with one cotyledon present here. And then this is the plant embryo here. And then in the top picture, you can see a dicot where you've got two cotyledons, the dark blue, and the plant embryo sandwiched in between. So if you were to look at a bean seed and soften the shell, remove the coating of the bean, then what you'd see are these two kidney-shaped structures. These are the cotyledons, and they, for this particular type of bean, hold a lot of starch and will provide sugars for the growing plant embryo, which is right here. Okay, you can see like a little plumule or foliage leaf coming off of the embryo. Okay, so monocots and dicots, they are differentiated based on the number of cotyledons, but also based on some other characteristics that you can observe just by looking at the plant. We had touched on a few of these, I think, last week, but they include the number of petals and sepals, the direction of the veins within the leaves. So if the veins are running in a parallel orientation versus a branched orientation, as well as the orientation of the cells in the roots and the stems. So we're going to flip to the next slide to examine those a little bit closer. This slide should look a little bit familiar. We already looked at the roots and the stems and noticed that the xylem and phloem for monocots in the root is arranged in rings within a cross section of the root. And then in dicots, you can see that the phloem and the xylem, the phloem is located in between the arms of the xylem, and the xylem might form an X or a star typed pattern in the middle of the root cross section. And then again, the top row is contains all characteristics of monocots, including, of course, one cotyledon. And then in our stems of monocots, the xylem and the phloem are scattered in these vascular bundles throughout the stem. And then in a dicot, they form concentric rings in the stem. And then, as I had mentioned, for monocots, the venation in the leaves takes on a parallel orientation for monocots, and then a webbing, a net-like pattern in the leaf of a dicot. And today we're going to specifically look at flowers and observe the differences in the petals and the sepals when they're typically representing monocots or dicots. So for monocots, you'll often see that the petals and the sepals, which are these green structures here, are arranged in groups of 3. So it could be 3 or 6 or 9, so forth, if it's a monocot. And then if the angiosperm is a dicot, you'll often see the flower parts in sets of 4 or 5. So if there are 5 petals or 4 petals, it's most likely a dicot. And then as well, we had mentioned that the root structure is different. Whereas in a dicot, you often see this primary taproot with some roots coming off of it. And in a monocot, you've got more of a fibrous root system associated with that. So now we're going to really hone in on flowers and look at some anatomy of the flower first. So the flower, before I get too far, this is where the plant's reproductive organs are located. And we can classify flowers based on their symmetry. So they're either radially symmetric, so you can cut them in any plane and have them be symmetric, or they're bilaterally symmetric, similar to what we looked at when we were examining different species in the animal kingdom. So we will look at the symmetry as well as the relationship of the ovary in position to the other flower parts, such as the petals and sepals. So first, let's go over a few anatomical terms for the flower. Starting at the bottom, this stalk for a flower is called the pedicel. That's the little stem for the flower. And that leads to the receptacle, which is this portion here where you can see the attachment point of the other floral parts. So the petals will be coming off of the receptacle. The sepals will be coming off of the receptacle. There's often a bract as well. A bract, and it's not shown in this picture, but it's a single leaf-like structure. It's going to be lower in position than the sepals. So it'll be coming off of the pedicel at a lower point, and it's just one. It's not present on all flowers, but you might see it on some. And then these green structures here, these are sepals. They, I should warn you, may not always be green. They could, in fact, look like the lowest layer of petals for the flower. But if you look closely, you'll usually see some distinguishing characteristics from the petals themselves. So for instance, the petal might be one uniform color, and then the sepal might have some spotting or slightly different color variations along the length of it. So take a look closely when we have you in lab this week to see if you can identify the sepals from the petals in each of the different types of flowers that we will have for you. And then most people know the petals are the colorful portion usually on the flower. And within those, then you'll find the reproductive parts of the plant. So usually the middle larger structure is the pistil, which holds the female reproductive cells. The top of the pistil is the stigma, and then the stalk is the style, and that leads to the ovary at the base. And within the ovary are ovules. And I'll mention now, but we'll revisit again later, that the ovary is where the fruit is going to develop from. So the fruit of an angiosperm will be formed as the ovary develops. And then within that fruit, there's often seeds. Seeds develop from the ovules. As you'll see here, these little things here are the ovules held within the ovary. And so that's going to develop into the seeds of the plant. And then I'll also mention that there are usually many different stamen, these structures here. And the top part of the stamen is called the anther. And then the stalk of that is called the filament. Okay. So we're going to go to the next slide where we're going to look closer at the female reproductive organ on our plant. So this is the pistil, the entire thing here, the green structure is the pistil, with the top being the stigma, the little knob button-like structure on the top is the stigma, the stalk is the style, and then the ovary is the enlarged portion at the base. Okay. And you also see in this diagram that there's a pollen grain that has landed on top of our pistil and has started to grow down the style and is heading towards the ovary. And this is because pollen grain is, as you'll learn more in the next video, pollen grain is where the sperm for the plant develop. And those are obviously from the male reproductive parts, which we'll get to. This diagram is just showing you how fertilization can take place by sperm meeting with the egg inside the ovary, which also holds the ovule. So ovule is where you're going to get the development of the egg. All this will be covered in the second part of this week's PowerPoint. But this is just an overview for now of our female reproductive organs in the center of the flower. Now, this diagram also mentioned shows a simple ovary. So this is the ovary, and it has just one carpel. So one portion that has one set of ovules. This is an ovule, and you can see there's just one present. So there's only one carpel, which makes this a simple ovary. The next picture that I'm going to show you is a compound ovary, and it is also a cross section through the ovary. So if you were to cut the ovary where this dotted line is and look at the cut surface, then you would see something like this, with the exception that this is a cross section through a compound ovary. Whereas if it were just a simple ovary, you would see just one portion of it. So what I'm circling here is a carpel. This is another carpel, and this is a third carpel. So the fact that there are more than one make this a compound ovary. Simple ovaries would just have one carpel. Okay, so within each carpel, you have ovules and a space surrounding the ovules called a locule. And the ovules are attached to the ovary wall at a point referred to as the placenta. Okay. So this is showing you cross section through a compound ovary with the ovules in the center. And if you'll remember, the ovules will develop into the seeds, and then the entire ovary will develop into the fruit of the plant. So we're going to take another sort of a step back to look at now a side view of our stigma, style, and ovary. And we should be able to determine and categorize our flowers based on whether or not the ovary is superior to the other parts of the flower, such as the petals and the sepals, or whether or not it is sort of in the middle of the attachment point for these petals and sepals, or if it's lower in position than the attachment point for these petals and sepals. So if the ovary is located above the attachment point for these appendages of the flower, then we say that the floral appendages are hypogynous. So they are below the gynecium or ovary. If the attachment parts or the appendages are attached sort of in the middle of the ovary, then we say that they are perigynous. And if the appendages are attached above the ovary, then we say that they are epigynous, or above the ovary. Okay. Now, keep in mind as we go through this week's lab that the ovary develops into the fruit. So if you examine a piece of fruit and you can locate where the stem is and where the sepals and petals came off of the fruit, then you would also be able to tell whether or not that plant had floral parts that were hypogynous, perigynous, or epigynous. So I have an example here. I'm just going to show you. So this is a strawberry, and you'll remember that the strawberry, the fruit itself, developed from the ovary. And if you look closely, let's see if I can orient, you would see that the stem is here, and that these green things, these are the sepals for the strawberry plant. And so if you think about it, the stem is here, the sepals are here, and the ovary is here. So we can see in this particular example that the attachment point for our flower appendages is below the ovary. Okay, so the ovary is superior, And that would make our floral appendages hypogynous, okay, below the ovary. So that's just one example. I also have an apple, okay, where you can see that this is the stem where the apple would have been attached to the plant. And then on the other side, you see these little green things. That's where the appendages came off. The sepals and the petals would have been here. And so in this case, if I hold it by the stem, you can see the ovary formed into the fruit, and that the sepals and the petals would have been on the other side. So the ovary in this case is down below the attachment point of our sepals. So this has floral parts that are epigynous to the ovary, okay? So I hope that makes sense. We have a lot of examples of fruits in lab this week that will ask you to do just that, classify based on the position of the ovary in reference to the other appendages that belong to the flower. Okay. And then you can also classify flowers as based on their symmetry. So if they have a radial symmetry, such as the picture shown here, where you can really cut them on any plane and have a symmetric half, then we call them actinomorphic. And if they can only really be cut along one plane, such as this picture here, and have symmetry exist, then they're referred to as zygomorphic or bilaterally symmetric. Okay. All right, so let's move on to our fruits. As I said, fruit forms from the ovary, and its role is to protect the seeds, as well as aid in dispersal of those seeds by wind or animals. Animals will often eat the fruit, carry it somewhere, and deposit the seeds in another location. So this helps the plant to spread and populate other areas, other geographical regions. So fruits can also be classified, and we classify them usually as simple, aggregate, or multiple fruits. And in addition to any of those three, any of those can also be classified as accessory. So let's talk a little bit about what each of those means. So I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between this slide and the next one, because the next one has pictures and this one is a descriptive slide. So a simple fruit is a fruit that is formed from just one ovary that grew within one flower. So it could be either a simple ovary with one carpel, or it could be a compound ovary with multiple carpels, but it's one ovary in one flower. And then that ovary wall encloses the fruit. That's a simple fruit. And examples of these are peas and oranges. So I'm going to flip to the next slide to show you a picture of that. So you'll see that the peas are growing in a pod, and this is the ovary that has developed into now the fruit. The whole thing is the fruit. It came from the ovary, and it was one ovary that grew within one flower. Okay, so that's simple fruit. Okay, so now let's go back. An aggregate fruit then actually has several different ovaries which form a single fruit. Several ovaries, but only one flower. Okay, they kind of mature together, all of these ovaries that exist in the one flower, and then all of those ovaries kind of fuse and form one structure, which we consider the fruit. So the example for this is a raspberry. You can see in this picture here, raspberry, the fruit, grows within one flower, but there are lots of different carpels, lots of different ovaries existing within that one flower, okay? And that matures together, and the raspberry is what we consider the fruit then. So that is an aggregate fruit. And then we can also have a multiple fruit. Multiple fruit is when you have ovaries of several different flowers now that mature together into a single fruit. And so our example of that is a pineapple. Let's look at the picture here. You can see that there are lots of different flowers here, and each of those will develop a portion of what we consider the mature entire fruit. Okay, so each of these little segments developed from the ovary of individual flowers, separate little flowers. Okay, so those are multiple fruits. And then lastly, any of the above, any of these can also be classified with the term accessory. An accessory fruit is a fruit that develops from other floral parts besides the ovary. So it will include the ovary, but it might also include, say, the receptacle. And a great example of this is an apple or a pear. So these develop, if you look here at the flower, the ovary is held within the receptacle, and then this entire portion develops into the fruit. Okay, so the receptacle is actually what gives us the meat of the fruit in an accessory fruit, the juicy part, the part that we enjoy to eat. And then the core of the fruit is what's developed from the ovary. Okay, the seeds then would be again from the ovules. So I'm gonna move on to the next slide here. One key thing to identify accessory fruits is if they have a core, then you can assume that that is probably from the ovary. And then that surrounding tissue that we enjoy eating is formed from the receptacle. Okay. All right, and then just to show you a picture then of different fruits that can come from one ovary with either a simple or a compound ovary. As I had said in the previous picture, peas are a great example of a simple fruit that formed from a simple ovary. So there's only one carpel in that ovary. So this is a pea. Pea pod would be the same. It's just one space that contains ovules, the little seeds, the piece, what we might actually refer to as the pea, not the whole pea pod, but those form from the ovules. And then the space in between the ovules, that's called the locule. That's the space inside there, okay? So that's just one ovary with one carpel. If you look at the right-hand picture here, it's one ovary, but it has several different carpels. This is one carpel, here's another, and here's a third. And so this entire fruit, the tomato, is formed from one ovary, but it's got multiple carpels. So that's a compound ovary, okay? So if you look here, I ask how many carpels are in the tomato fruit, and you can see here, hopefully, you've been able to guess that there are 3 carpels that existed in that ovary. Okay. All right, and lastly, simple fruits form from one ovary, and then the ovary has different layers to it. So the pericarp of the fruit is broken up into 3 different parts: the exocarp, the mesocarp, and the endocarp. So in, for instance, a peach, the skin forms from the exocarp. The mesocarp is the fleshy, juicy part that we enjoy eating. And then the stone, which holds the seed, is the endocarp, okay? And then the seed, of course, is developed from the ovule, okay? All right, so that wraps up our discussion on plant anatomy. The next set of slides that I will post for this week are going to be focusing on reproduction in angiosperms. And then in lab this week, we're going to have a lot of fruits and flowers, as well as microscope slides for you to examine the larger morphology of the plants, flowers, and the fruit. And then the microscope slides will be what we'll use to examine our angiosperm reproduction. Okay, any questions, you can always shoot me an email at cfry@lvc.edu. Have a good week.